Welcome to Momentous. I am Pastor Rebecca Great, the pastor mission developer for Momentous and the host for our weekly podcast. At Momentous, we believe that God is present with us in each and every single one of our moments. We believe that our stories are connected to God's story and to one another's stories. We believe that this connection and relationship changes our lives and our entire world. Now, before we begin, I invite you to take a deep breath in. Hold it while you count to 3, and then slowly release that breath. For this summer, we are spending our entire time at Sabbath stops, at times designed for sacred rest, to reconnect with God and with those around us and with creation. Summer is a season where almost all of our schedules completely shift from what they are during the school year. As many of us travel over the next few months, we are going to intentionally stop, just like we would at a rest stop on the road. So, grab a snack, grab some water to drink, stretch, and take another deep breath. Now, in last week's podcast, we intentionally slowed down to pause by engaging in Lectio Divina, which is that sacred reading and listening to some verses from the Bible and to what God might be nudging us to do or change or however we might respond. Now, that episode will always be available if you ever want to have someone guide you through that process again. And we'll probably use it in upcoming podcasts. We also posted a graphic that outlines the process for Lectio Divina. We posted that on our social media pages, where you can find it and screenshot it and keep it in your phone with you wherever you are. I've also linked that same graphic in the transcript for today's episode in case you are one of our followers who doesn't happen to use social media. Also, it would be helpful for you to listen to last week's podcast before you continue on with this week's, because I give a little more of an explanation about why we are starting with these verses rather than some of the others in either the Christian Old or New Testaments. And I promise you that is important because we are focusing on the same verses from Leviticus this week as we did in last week's episode. And for those of us who aren't as enthused by Lectio Divina, you can take a deep breath that will not be our spiritual or Sabbath practice for this week. This week, we are going to use those same 3 verses to help us understand some of the reasonings and the whys behind Sabbath being a necessary part of our lives to begin with. Because if you're like me, there may be at least a small portion of you that will rebel against doing anything simply because someone else tells you to do it. I promise you, the quickest way to have me not do something is to tell me that I just need to do it, and to not provide any reasoning or context, and to dismiss all of my questions. Hence, some background this week. So let's remind ourselves what those 3 verses from Leviticus are. The first is, it is a Sabbath of complete rest to you, and you shall deny yourselves. It is a statute forever. And the second verse is, for 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord throughout your settlements. And then the third set of two verses are, for 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in their yield. But in the seventh year there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest for the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. So here are my immediate questions. What does complete rest mean? And how does pairing that with Sabbath make it different from vacation? What happens if we cannot Sabbath on Sunday because that is when we must work, or that is when our kid has woken up puking, or that is when we are driving to or driving from somewhere, or that is literally the only time this week when we can catch up on anything? Can the day of Sabbath move, or are we continually on a work 6 days and then the next day is Sabbath cycle forever and ever? And then my third question is, how did the statute for an entire year of Sabbath, not just a single day, change and reorient the entire community so that they could still have food when they weren't able to farm? So let's take them one at a time. What does complete rest mean? And how does pairing that with Sabbath make it different from vacation? Now, I don't mean this to feel like I'm trying to get out of answering the question, but I think the definition of complete rest is different for every single person. Because for some people, it means absolutely doing nothing whatsoever and just sitting there and sipping on something to drink and just people watching. And for some others, it means watching TV or talking to a friend on the phone. For some others, it might mean going out and exploring where you live and taking a hike or going on a driving tour. I know it has to be different for different people because I feel much calmer and like I have rested when I have spent some time listening to an audiobook and knitted or crocheted. And if you tell my husband to do those same things so that he can completely rest, he will be unamused, to say the very least. But I will say that I'm not sure if the time I spent listening to an audiobook and knitted or crocheted is Sabbath. I know it is rest, but I am unsure if it is Sabbath. In the book Wholehearted Faith by Rachel Held Evans, she writes, all Sabbath is rest, but not all rest is Sabbath. Rest is not Sabbath if your comfort is contingent on others' discomfort. Rest is not Sabbath if it exacerbates inequity rather than diminishing it. Now, to me, that points to Sabbath and rest being sort of like a Venn diagram where there's a portion that overlaps, but There are also areas where they don't overlap, and something can be Sabbath but not rest, and something else can be rest but not Sabbath. Now, I agree with Rachel Held Evans' quote, but I will also add that according to my Christian denomination, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we also understand Sabbath as being a way to reconnect with God and with one another and with all of creation. Now, I know a fair chunk of our listening audience is made up of pastors and deacons and other people who serve in leadership roles in the church, so this may make them blanch. But Sabbath does not always mean attending worship within a church building on Sundays. Now, it can be that. And for a lot of people, that is what Sabbath is. But from my years of serving in leadership within the church, I also know that every Sunday morning when I was entrusted with leading worship, I didn't Sabbath for a single minute of it. I was always focused on what I needed to do and where I needed to be in the worship space, what the next few things coming up during the service were, so that I could also make sure the people in charge of those pieces were where they needed to be. And as a pastor, I know I wasn't the only one. All of our worship leaders were so busy, and I am fairly confident that they didn't Sabbath at all while they were helping with leading worship. And I don't know that any of us were faithful at finding other opportunities for Sabbath when we weren't in charge. So particularly for those in church leadership roles, Sabbath will look very different than worship on Sunday mornings. At least it's really likely it will. It may even necessarily need it to happen on a different day of the week, which leads me to my next question. What happens if we cannot Sabbath on Sunday because that is when we must work, or that is when the kid has woken up puking, or that is when we are driving to or from somewhere, or that is literally the only time this week when we can catch up on anything? Can the day of Sabbath move? Or are we continually on a work 6 days and then the next day is Sabbath cycle forever and ever? Growing up, I always understood that Sunday was Sabbath and we were supposed to attend worship in order to fulfill whatever the obligation was. Now, that's not necessarily what the church was actually teaching, but it's definitely the message that sunk in. And then at some point during college, I remembered hearing the chaplain of our campus ministry talking about the difference between following the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law in regards to honoring the Sabbath. Now, for someone who is following the absolute letter of the law, they will work for 6 days and then take 1 day to spend in Sabbath. That is what that verse from Leviticus seems like it indicates. Now, for someone who is following the spirit of the law, they will understand that we are called to spend an entire day in Sabbath, but that needs to happen at some point during a week's time frame. Personally, I would like it very much if all of the healthcare workers and first responders who follow a faith tradition that honors Sabbath or sacred rest to not take it all on the same day. People get very sick and still need health care or access to it, Sabbath or not. Now, I tend to fall in the spirit of the law camp because to me, it seems to indicate a gracious invitation and call to spend time reconnecting with God and with one another and with creation. It takes into account that sometimes the unexpected things happen and they must be tended. And that doesn't mean that we have failed and we've missed an opportunity. It means that we just take an opportunity for Sabbath the next time we're able, hopefully within a reasonable time frame, however that ends up getting defined. So now for that last question. How did the statute for an entire year of Sabbath, not just a single day, how did that change and reorient the entire community so that they could still have food when they weren't able to farm? Now, I find it absolutely fascinating that in the course of only a few chapters, Leviticus has gone from describing Sabbath as being 1 day per week to being 1 whole year in a 7-year time frame. I did not grow up in a farming community, so I really and truly know very little about good and faithful farming practices. I know that there is a rotation cycle to planting soybeans and corn, but I could not tell you any of the specifics of it. But since being ordained in 2014, I have served congregations in Indiana and Ohio, which are filled with farms. And I don't ever remember seeing any of them lie dormant for an entire year. But if you are someone who farms and can tell me more about whether or not this is actually practiced, I would love to know. Please send me an email or a message. Now, something that is unclear to me in these two verses is whether or not the entirety of farmland is to be untilled for the entire year, or if it rotated through the community as each plot arrived to its 7th year. But either way, I find it astounding that an entire year is to be spent in giving creation a chance to recover from the hard work of growing food, and how this calls the entire community to plan ahead and care for one another. If part of or all of the farmland is not being farmed for that year, they had to rely on one another in an entirely different way than if they were continually planting and harvesting. And this also means that they had more of an opportunity to strengthen their relationships within the community, and they could spend more time with God. I wonder how living into a year of Sabbath could change our lives and our communities and our relationship with God. Now, I know that many of us are stressed. Some of us to capacity or almost there, because summer is officially in full swing. And for this week, instead of offering a prayer, I'm going to offer a few different prayer practices. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to invite you to set aside the entire list of everything you think you need to be doing right now. If you need to go write it down so that you don't worry about forgetting it, pause the podcast, write it down, and come back when you're able. These practices invite you to focus on things that are true while you are in a state of stress. And like I said, you're going to have a few options for how you want to engage with this, either today or at some point in the future, or both. So the first practice means looking around and mentally or physically listing 5 things that you can see, and then listing 4 things you can hear, and then listing 3 things you can smell, then 2 things you can touch, and 1 thing you can taste. And if you aren't able to engage with one or more of your senses, you are welcome to engage with the senses you're able to, or you can engage in one of the other options. Because another option for this practice means simply taking a series of deep breaths and focusing on pushing out all other thoughts out of your mind and waiting for your heart rate to come down. Another option for this practice means clenching all of your muscles one at a time, not all of them all at once, one at a time. And you start at the very, very top of your body, and you clench your topmost muscle. So a lot of us, that's our eyebrows. And you clench them for 5 to 10 seconds, and then you gently release them. And you repeat this process, moving down your body until you are at your toes. So today, I'm going to invite you to pause the podcast and engage in at least one of these options as soon as you are able to help us engage in a few moments of Sabbath. And if you need to do that later in the day to day because you aren't able to right now, that's okay. But as you engage in one or more of these practices, I want you to focus on this thought. I'm here, God. Help me rest in you. Thank you for joining us for our weekly Moment to Us. We are looking forward to growing with each of you and are so grateful you are part of the Momentous community. Thank you to our mission partners, the Southern Ohio Synod and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Their financial contributions and their prayers have been instrumental in bringing this new ministry into existence. This week, I also want to thank Advent Lutheran Church in Upper Arlington, which is one of the suburbs of Columbus. They have called me again to preach and lead worship with them this morning. Now, they will be live streaming their 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, their 10 a.m. worship service this morning on YouTube. And I've direct linked their YouTube channel in the transcript for this episode, which is located on our website. inviting me to supply preach or to lead an education event or a retreat or just be present with you for worship and answer questions are additional ways that congregations and ministries can partner with Momentous. However you are engaging with or discerning partnering with Momentous, we hope that it means you are growing in your faith and noticing God's presence with you. You can always share moments when you noticed God's presence by sending us an email at dailymomentous@gmail.com or sending us a direct message on our social media accounts or leaving us a voicemail. If you want to support the ministry of Momentous, know that engaging with us online is one way to do so. And if you are able to give financially, you can visit our website and use the donate link there. Each one-time or recurring gift combines together to ensure the Momentous community continues to grow. Now, this week, we crossed another major milestone. At some time this past Friday, we have had over 1,000 downloads of the Momentous podcast across all of our platforms. This means that the goal we set as a part of the initial dreaming about and praying for Momentous to launch is well underway. We had initially set a goal of 3,000 podcast downloads in the first year. We are 1/3 of the way to meeting that goal, 7 weeks ahead of schedule. So already, we are paying attention to what God is up to, and we are revising our goals and our plans to be more in line with what God is up to, instead of only what we had dreamed and discerned. We are grateful for each of you listening during your weeks and sharing episodes with others. If you've missed a few episodes, that is okay, because I know I am terrible at remembering to log in and download a new episode every single week. So make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your preferred podcasting platform to make sure each episode automatically downloads to your devices and you don't miss another one. And if you haven't yet had a chance to rate our podcast or to type in and leave a review, we would love for you to do that this week. Each rating and review helps bump our podcast up the charts to make even more people have easy access to get connected with the Momentous community. And that invites them into noticing God's presence within their busy moments too. Every time you interact with us online through social media or through podcasts, it helps the algorithms know that this is resonating with you. And noticing God's presence is something worth sharing online. Each interaction helps our community reach even more people through your profiles and for how each platform engages with your friends and followers. We give thanks for every single one of you, for being a part of the Momentous community, for listening to God's call to try something new, and for beginning to notice God's presence even more frequently in your life, in our communities, and in our world. Until our next podcast, remember to breathe deeply and that God is present with you every single moment.